All right, good morning. It is 10 o'clock. A special meeting of the Region 2000 Services Authority. Welcome, everybody. First item on our agenda are the pro forma scenarios review. Clark, Alec, what do you guys want on us today?
We'll have Philip Kramer from Burns McDonald, who prepared the drafts, run through the 4 scenarios that they've developed on our behalf.
Good morning, Philip. We appreciate you joining us from Austin today. Hope everything is copacetic and warm there.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, everyone. I'll also be joined in a second by Scott Pasternak, who is our department manager for the solid waste division down here in Austin, Texas at Burns McDonald. And if at any point you guys have any questions or want to reach out to me to ask questions, just please let me know. Alec, would you like me to go ahead and share my screen?
That'd be great. Yes, sir. And just give us like a 30-second synopsis of what the pro forma is and why we developed it, if you could.
Yes. Great. So I'll go through this very quickly. This first scenario is the status quo, where we assume that the $10 excess revenue charge is reserved and is not allocated to any operational reserves or expenditures. So this is what we would call our status quo. And there is the 75-25% split between Campbell County and the Services Authority of that excess revenue. In this scenario, as you can see, we've projected and we've recommended an increase of the tipping fee, which is variable across the 4 years, but it's around that $53 to $55 range is what we recommended. And that range is recommended because the Services Authority will need to begin seriously considering the amount of money that they need to reserve in the post-closure fund. As you can see by this line 20, we have that contribution increasing up to $4.6 million per year in 26 to 27. For all of these scenarios, what we've done is worked with the Services Authority staff, the financial advisors at Davenport, to develop financial costs that offset the amount that you guys would have to spend in fiscal year 2029. And the reason that we've done that is to help maintain a tipping fee that remains relatively consistent across the 4 years. So we've updated that. We worked with the group at Davenport to update that service schedule. We evaluated what is needed on an equipment replacement reserve perspective, and that's consistent across all the scenarios. So moving on to the next scenario, we have an alternative where 75% of the excess revenue is allocated to the Services Authority, and then 25% gets allocated to Campbell County. So that's kind of a flip. And in this scenario, what we show here is in line 21, just for communication purposes, to let you know that we are allocating the Services Authority's distribution of that excess revenue to the post-closure fund. This line 29, the revenue offsets for reserves, just shows that this is not impacting the member rate. So there is a net zero impact on of this cost that we're showing in line 21. But what that does, as you'll remember, line 20, we were showing that was $4.6 million. That reduces your contribution from the member rate by $1 million per year in those years. So what we saw as the $53 per ton recommended cost of service rate was dropped down to 48 here. The next scenario is where 100% of the excess revenue is allocated to the Services Authority. And again, we've assumed that all of that revenue is distributed to the post-closure fund. And again, you can see further decrease in the member tipping fee over the 26 to 28 period. You'll notice that in these next scenarios, that $55 per ton for 2029 remains consistent. That's just because you have a partial year of tonnage. There's only so many costs we can cut. So for this current scenario and the prior one that I showed, We did as much as we could to make the member rate consistent across the 4 years, but there is still that slight jump in 2029 for that reason. The final scenario, which we recently developed, looked at, again, what if 100% of the excess revenue going forward is allocated to the closure post-closure fund, but also what if we moved the currently held reserves, 100% of them, into that closure post-closure fund. So what does that do for us? And as you'll see, what we're showing here is a $31.04 member rate over the 4 years. That slightly deviates from our methodology in the prior pro formas that we showed, where we set the member rate exactly equal to the cost of service rate. And the reason is because we're looking to build up a reserve in these 3 years of fiscal year 26, 27, and 28, so that you don't have that jump to $55 per ton in 2029. So we use that offset to keep you guys at a constant rate for the 4 years. You also note that the authority would not be making any closure post-closure contributions beyond what was generated from the excess revenue. And there's also enough money in the reserve, and based on our projections of tonnage and also the revenue that you're bringing from that market rate, you would be able to reduce the amount that you would have to transfer into the closure post-closure fund to repay yourself for the property acquisition loan for the Bennett property. And so this is the final scenario that we developed. And again, this is the $31 across the 4 years. And I overheard the conversation at the beginning of the meeting that Clark and Alec were communicating that these scenarios do not communicate any of the findings from the salary and compensation study that's being completed currently. So there may be some tweaks. And this is also labeled draft because we're going to be receiving some updated closure, post-closure estimates from the services authorities landfill engineer. So keep that all in mind, but these are the starting places for these 4 scenarios. Are there any questions that I could answer from the group?
Here, I have a question.
Okay.
Do any of these pro forma scenarios build in any type of escalation for closure, post-closure after 2026?
Yeah, so we assume about a 3% increase. And there's an inflation factor considered for all costs in all 4 of these pro forma scenarios, and it's around 3% is what I'm remembering from my model.
Okay, thank you.
And every year we update that based on what the engineers at TRC provide, and that's based on, I think, the inflation rate that's communicated by the Virginia DEQ. So that is all considered in this modeling exercise.
Mr. Chair, for me. Philip, thanks very much for the pro formas and the walkthrough there. Just to be clear, it is only the 4th scenario that factors in all the held money and presumes that the authority can avail itself of all of those dollars, correct?
Yes, sir.
Bill, this is a question for you, given that there's pending litigation over those dollars. And we've got your opinion that certain of those dollars should have been released. Do you have any concerns with us even contemplating a scenario that factors those dollars into a pro forma this way?
I don't, Frank. I mean, the litigation, is in progress. There's not been any decisions any one way or the other. So I don't think the fact that there's litigation prohibits the board from taking any action it wants to take.
Thank you. And so then I'd go to staff, particularly with the 4th option, which has the appeal of the lowest tip fee. That's an effective solution if through the litigation the authority prevails, the dollars are available. However, if Campbell prevails, in some period of time between now and 29, we'll have that issue to deal with. Has there been any sort of scenario run around that? Wherein if we were to come out of the gate with that scenario today and in 27, 28 realize we couldn't avail ourselves of those reserve dollars, you're still going to have the huge spike in 29. Staff's aware of that, but that's just the fact, that's the risk conversation for the authority to have.
Philip, this is actually, Susan, do you have questions?
No, I'm good.
Philip, this is Greg. In scenario 4, does this assume that all funding related to the 75-25 or related to the excess revenue, we'll call it, the $10 premium that the commercial haulers pay, that all of that goes to closure post-closure, or all of that goes to the authority, and then what is needed for closure post-closure is then moved into that account?
So the assumption is that it goes to the authority, but it is 100% allocated to closure post-closure. And so the way that we looked at it is we looked at the current fund balance of the closure post-closure fund. We added in what you guys currently have reserved. And then we looked at adding in the excess revenue moving forward, 100% of it. There was a little bit left over at the end. So to find a way for the authority to effectively use those dollars, we looked at reducing the amount that the authority would have to pay for the internal loan, because we still considered a liability to the closure post-closure fund for that property acquisition. So we used the remaining dollars of that. And you can see, so if you look at line 38 on the where we show in the prior years, $413,000 from 2028, you'll see that we've reduced that to $267,000 in 27, $0 in 2028. And so that was effectively an additional payment that was made to the closure post-closure fund that by releasing that excess revenue would help further bring down the member rate for your communities.
Philip, if I'm reading this correctly, in FY 2029, there are no debt service payments here. Does that mean any outstanding debt owed by the authority has been paid off by that point in time?
Yes, sir. So we worked with the folks over at Davenport to develop an updated debt service schedule for the phase 5 of the landfill, and assumed that the property acquisition be fully paid off for that time. Additionally, the prior scenarios looked at financing any future equipment purchases to reduce the cost. This scenario assumes that the authorities would pay cash for those, so that there was, no remaining cell development equipment debt service payments remaining in 2029.
And does this scenario, Philip, make any assumptions about disposition of any authority assets?
I do not believe so at this time. I think several of the assets will need to be retained for the period of post-closure. And that would be something that we would need to coordinate with Alec and Clark and team to discuss.
Thank you. Any other questions? But I think as we look down through the agenda, I think it might make sense at this point to go through the next 2 items before returning to any thoughts we may have on the pro forma scenarios to move forward with. I would ask either by consent initially, and if not by vote, that we that we move the disposition of excess or an airspace reserve revenue to number 3 on the agenda, and the fiscal policy provision number 4. Does anyone on the board have an issue with that?
No, no.
I appreciate it. All right. So the next item is the disposition of excess and airspace reserve revenue. Alec or Clark, or anyone on staff, can you give us a breakdown of how much the total funding held in escrow currently, and how much of that is what we call excess revenue, and how much of that is what we call airspace reserve?
Currently, we have $9 million in 4 accounts that qualify as excess revenue and airspace reserve revenue. Excess revenue amounts to $4.8 million and was collected until September of 2021. Since that time, airspace reserve revenue funded by that same $10 increment over the member rate is now totals $4.2 million. So we're just a shade over $9 million in those 4 LGIPs combined.
That includes interest.
Yes.
Can I follow on with the locality breakout for that, Mr. Brevner?
Yes, sir. I have the balance sheet in front of you.
I need clarification. You said airspace reserve 4.2 million
Yes.
and excess revenue 8.4?
4.8.
4.8.
For a total of 9. The amounts are, Lynchburg is roughly $1.1 million. Campbell County is between the two the Services Authority is a little over $1 million as well. So Campbell County is roughly $7 million between the 2 accounts. And sadly, balance sheet precise.
Does that include interest?
And that's as of what date?
That's as of January 31st of 2025.
Okay, so that's more than midway through this fiscal year. So. And Clark, forgive me if you don't have this information in front of you, but as we contemplate what has been most recently calculated as, roughly $16 million as our post-closure obligation, can you give us either specifically or generally what percentage of that obligation is allocated to each of the 4 member localities?
I do have it right here if you'd like to change that question.
Yeah, what you're referring to is our financial assurance.
Yes.
Which is what we're required to submit to the EQ every year, so that we will either have the cash in hand, or each municipality will pay their fair share of post-closure closure at the end of once we reach capacity, begin closure, if there's not the cash in hand. So as of 7/30/24, which is, let me see.
One of those is related to the Concord Turnpike, and the
Yeah,
other,
that's right. That's what I was looking at.
yeah, is livestock road.
Yeah. Here's the livestock road. Yeah, this makes more sense. Yeah, livestock road facility, Lynchburg, is 59.5%. Campbell County is 33.8%. Nelson is 4.1%. Town of Bedford, which is still responsible for a small percentage of the waste that they put in while they were members, is at 0.1%, and Appomattox is 2.5%.
Do you have that broken out by dollar amount as well at this point?
Mm-hmm. Obligation for Lynchburg is just over 10 million. Campbell County is $5,681,522. Nelson County is $689,179. Town of Bedford continuing their obligation, even though they're not a member, is $16,809, and Appomattox is $420,231. Now, each year the authority updates those numbers and sends this to each municipality. It's not necessarily cash that you have to budget in your budget every year, because the DEQ allows each local government to do what's called a local government test, which basically says that that we have the authority to raise that money through taxation if it's necessary, so we don't have to budget it every year. But the authority, with these pro formas that we've presented today, shows that we will have 100% of the money needed to close and fund the post-closure period. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, absolutely. And Sandy, do you have that breakdown of the, or did you give to Alex? Alec, sorry, Alec.
Gotcha. This is as of December or February. As of February 28th, 2025, Lynchburg's share of excess revenue was $1,482,921.36. The Services Authority share is $1,071,293.35. The two Campbell County pots are $3,343,562 and $3,172,814.95. So roughly 6.5, so slightly overestimated.
And how much cumulative interest is that in that number?
Makes sense.
Right now, roughly 500,000 a year.
Yes, right.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but closure, post-closure costs are supposed to be factored into operating expenses, and those are funded with tip fee. Is that a correct statement? Yes. So there's two things here, right? We have the collection of excess revenues over time, which were intended to pay for an asset. And then we have the obligation for closure and post-closure. They're two separate things that the authority is responsible for: payment for assets received and funding for closure, post-closure costs anticipated. So there will be no surprise to anybody that I reject the commingling of those concepts, of course, but the tip fee exists to fund closure, post-closure. Other funds weren't accrued for that purpose.
Any other thoughts? Well,
So are we at the point where we're on disposition of assets? Because I'd like to make the motion.
yes,
So I would like to go ahead and make a motion that the authority release the held excess revenue payments and airspace reserve payments to the respective parties in accordance with the terms of the member use agreement and standing authority practice and the written financial policy of the authority that has been adopted and approved by this entity.
do I have a second? Motion dies without a second. I will make a motion that all excess revenue funds, that roughly 4.8 million that Alec mentioned, of which I think Lynchburg has a direct claim on about $1.5 million, be distributed immediately to the closure, post-closure.
Second that motion.
Any discussion?
Yes.
Yeah, first on your second. Do you have any discussion?
No.
Right.
Okay, so you're parting out the it's 9 million total, and you're going back to the original funds accrued by way of the member use agreement, the $10 surcharge. And rather than paying Lynchburg and Campbell for airspace brought to the authority, You are instead directing those dollars to closure, post-closure for the period of now to 2029.
This motion is specific to the excess revenue that was related to prior to the change in the financial policy. So it's the 4.8 million on this motion. So it's the money that was split roughly, 70-30 by Lynchburg and Campbell. That 4.8 million is specifically what I'm referring to.
Yeah, okay. I just want to be clear. That's the money that was collected to pay Lynchburg and Campbell for airspace they brought to the authority. Those are the dollars we're talking about.
Yes, that's what the motion is, to distribute those funds directly to the closure, post-closure reserve in their entirety.
A little extra follow-up if I may, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask each member, if you were hosting a landfill in your community, would you negotiate for a host fee to mitigate impact? Susan, would that be a factor in your negotiation?
My experience with working with regional authorities, I was from Charlotte County. And we were in a regional authority, and we did not pay Mecklenburg County host fee.
Right, but if you were negotiating on behalf of Appomattox County today to site a landfill facility, would you negotiate to have some nature of a host fee?
That's to be determined by the members.
Certainly something to contemplate, right? Candy, I'd ask you the same question.
I really don't think the question's relevant to the motion in hand.
I'm going down a path as to the appropriate disposition of these funds and as they relate to the impact in my community of the asset being there. So that's the nexus I'm drawing.
I understand where you're coming from, but I don't feel a response is appropriate.
Okay. Greg, you can offer any response to that?
I would just say it's difficult to no decision like that is made in a vacuum, and without context, it's very difficult to provide an answer.
That's fair. I think the context at the time was known. I think the member use agreement contemplated a relationship that passed the burden of paying for this airspace. It's not even to those of us sitting around the table. It's the commercial haulers, very few of whom come from Appomattox, 0 of whom come from Nelson. And so we're now taking those dollars that saved all of us from having to pay for that airspace, and we're instead directing it post-closure that ought to be charged against the tip fee. We should be able to do both things. We're structured to do both things, and we ought to continue to move all the way through closure doing both things. I will, of course, vote against the motion.
Candy, any thoughts?
No.
Call the vote. Sue?
Yes.
Yes.
Frank?
No.
And I'm a yes.
So, Mr. Chairman, I think there's still in question the airspace reserve. And I would like to move that 100% of that airspace reserve, $4.2 million, be dispersed to the authority's closure, post-closure.
Second.
Would you like to speak to your motion?
No comment.
Would you like to speak to your second?
I just think that this action is in the best interest of the authority to cover our closure, post-closure obligations that are upcoming.
If I may. Make sure I understand the motion. This is inclusive retroactively of all the dollars that have been held to date. This isn't just a forward-looking policy change. Is that correct? So,
as I understand it, this is just looking at the funds that are in escrow currently.
right. So this is a retroactive action to undo a policy that we didn't conform to for a number of years. Understand that correct? I'll be belaboring the point.
Off of vote. Susan?
Yes.
Candy?
Yes.
Frank?
No.
Yes. Next item on the agenda, the fiscal policy revisions. Alec or Clark, can you give us the history of the financial policy, specifically as they relate to the 75-25 airspace reserve split and when those were enacted, when they were voted on, and then when they actually became effective?
Since I was around, I'll go ahead and just give you just a brief history of how we got to that point. Was we were discussing the member use agreement. This is probably 10, 15 years ago. And how it would relate moving forward once we reach the capacity number that was in the original member use agreement. Because at some point we would reach that number, which I believe it was a couple of years ago, we reached that number that was included the capacity that Lynchburg brought to the table and Campbell County brought to the table. We did an expansion during that time, which was not included in that member, and that volume was not included in the member use agreement originally. So we were at a point where we were getting, we needed to make some decisions on how to move forward once we reached that original volume that was in the original member use agreement. So we developed these financial policies, and at the time it was the board had agreed on setting aside 75% of the excess revenue moving forward that would not be part of that original distribution between Lynchburg and Campbell County. The board voted to set aside 75% of that excess revenue as a host fee to be paid to Campbell County, and 25% of that excess revenue would go back into the authority's budget. And we just, there was a discussion of the need to develop a financial policy that the board would adopt, which included that as well as numerous other items dealing with the authority's finances.
If I may.
Sir.
And that policy was written such that those payments were effectively automatic, right? As part of the annual planning of the authority, didn't require a special vote of any kind.
That's right.
And are there other policies within that financial policy document that guide our financial behavior now? What else outside of that? Outside of how we treat the excess revenue or airspace reserve revenue, what other items are in those financial policies?
There's the post-closure reserve fund, the equipment replacement reserve fund, the environmental remediation reserve fund, an operation and maintenance reserve, a debt service reserve, and a future disposal planning reserve.
Have we been following all of those financial policies?
Not exactly. Based on yearly annual budget needs and whether or not we think it's necessary as a board and as an authority staff, whether it's not necessary to put money aside according to these policies. An annual discussion during the budget is made to make those decisions.
Questions for staff?
Are any of these policies mirrored or already existing within the member use agreement? The
No.
reserve funds, equipment replacement reserve.
Yeah. Other than a general statement that the authority would have funds for to close the landfill mostly.
And what was the date that they were adopted?
March 14th, 2016 is what the document says.
They were developed around the time of the lateral expansion that exceeded the initially contemplated capacity. And so there was conversation about how to continue to recognize the local impact of hosting a landfill. So policies were written in totality, but also included the 75-25 split.
Yeah, it was at that time where we were going to have more capacity than the original member use agreement included.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think I'm ready to make a motion to revise this fiscal policy guidelines that were adopted March 14th, 2016. At the time, Nelson voted against this policy. We still stand very much against the policy, and I would like to revise the clause that's on page 1047. That states once the current airspace is consumed, the authority will distribute 75% of excess revenue to the current landfill host, and 25% will be retained to use planning as a means to self-fund projects or any other item approved by the board. I believe this effectively officially makes our previous action consistent with the policy.
And you said you would revise it. You would revise it how?
To remove that particular clause that references excess revenue be distributed 75% to the landfill host and 25% retained by the authority.
Thank you. So I have a motion to revise the financial policies retroactive to March 14th, 2016 to remove the language related to the 75-25 split of excess revenue for airspace reserve. Second.
I second that. And I'd also like to comment on it. I keep hearing the definition Campbell County, that being said. And I think if you go back to a member use agreement, it states that only it becomes those monies to Lynchburg, City of Lynchburg and Campbell, if it were to be voted on to be distributed to those localities. And there's not been a vote to distribute those funds. So it's a label put on the funding that's really, it's a reserve fund that hasn't been distributed or paid out to anyone.
Do we know in that original member use agreement, does the language say it shall be paid out or it may?
It may.
Be paid
And
out?
it would require an annual vote of the authority to distribute those funds.
Excess revenues are described differently in two different clauses. The operational clause says may, the definition says shall. It's the crux of pending litigation. There's been some procedural rulings where the courts have incorporated foundational documents that stress the intent was shall and not may. I understand the point being made, but just to your point, context matters. That's the question out there. If I may, some additional discussion on the motion.
Sure.
So Clark, you indicated there were other elements of the policy that we have not conformed to for budgetary reasons. Are we not contemplating any of those amendments or revisions today? Do we need to make any other changes? Or are we just specifically striking the language where Campbell would get some portion of revenue as the host locality?
You know, you mentioned, Frank, host agreement. I've not seen that in any of these documents. So when you ask if there's a host agreement, I've not been able to find anywhere that there was ever agreed upon to be a host agreement.
I appreciate that. I'm being too casual with the term. Sometimes we've thrown around excess revenue and host fee and the like, so I'm using them interchangeably, but I'll be more clear. Are we making any other changes or recommending other changes to the fiscal policies at this time, or just the one?
And if it's okay, I would add a follow-up to that. And that is with the distribution of the excess revenue and airspace reserve funds to the closure post-closure account, does that bring us in line with the rest of those financial policies at this point in time?
Again, for example, the environmental remediation reserve. That was a guideline to address any major environmental problems that we've had that could possibly come up. That's never happened. So we don't fund that. Operation and maintenance reserve, that's based on a formula. However, the budget falls out. We've have tried to follow that guideline. I'm not sure what the balance of that fund is, but I believe it was 3 months of operating expenses is what our goal was to, again, it was a goal. And a debt service reserve, we do follow that. Future planning disposal reserve. At one point, we were putting some money into that account just to do some engineering studies for expansions and cell developments. But we haven't seen the need to put any money in that account in the last several years either. So,
So I don't know Robert's Rules of Order well enough to know if I'm phrasing this correctly. Bill, you could correct me, but based on that information, is there a way to make a friendly amendment to the motion to, it sounds like we don't need the environmental and the future planning clauses in there at this point. Would you agree with that, Clark?
yes.
So would, I don't know if you could make a friendly amendment or if we need to make a
Yeah, the person who proposes the motion can make an amendment if she wants to.
I will amend my original motion to include removal of the environmental remediation reserve clause within the policy, and also the future disposal planning reserve clause as well.
Thank you.
Need a second to that?
Second,
The person who seconded it need to second that amendment.
second.
Any further discussion?
I have one more question, just for full disclosure. And you may have it or you may not have it. I know the authority has paid out a certain amount of money to Campbell County and the city of Lynchburg prior to 2019, 2018 timeframe. Do you know what that total number is,
We would have to,
the payout? I think it's somewhere around 10 million, maybe.
we would have to look at our past financial.
Well, it sounded like the authority hasn't paid any at all. That's why I want full disclosure that, yeah, there's been money paid to the counties.
Just a little bit of additional discussion. I'm just candidly left to question the need for a policy at all. If we have a policy that we don't conform to, if the budget's going to dictate, if we're striking certain clauses that are no longer necessary, is there still a need for a policy at all? The document the authority needs. If we're going to have a policy and not conform to it, what was the point?
I would add that we're amending the policy to bring it in line to what we are conforming to. So now our actions and policy align.
I appreciate that, but it's sort of working in reverse, right? Actions typically conform to policy. You don't write policy to conform to act. It's just the point I want to make.
Any other discussion? Call the vote. Susan?
Yes.
Andy?
Yes.
Frank?
No.
I'm a yes. Bill, I would ask you or staff, whoever is most appropriate to answer. We've made a change that is going to impact the operating budget for fiscal year 2025 with that excess revenue now coming into the authority's budget. do we need to amend the budget? Or is that something, if we need to amend the budget, that we can do at our next regularly scheduled meeting?
I think it would be a good idea to amend the budget to reflect the changes. I mean, you can simply make a motion to amend the FY25 budget to reflect the motions taken in this meeting, and that will be sufficient.
So moved.
Second that. Would you like to speak to your motion?
No. Place it on.
Any further comment? All right, call vote. Susan?
Yes.
Andy?
Yes.
Frank? Yes.
Yeah.
All right, I believe we are now moving on to my agenda. Fiscal year 2026 budget considerations. I would ask staff, the changes that we've made today materially impact the ability to walk through this document. Still a good idea to move forward with this agenda.
The budget that we presented in January and the one that we have included in today's packet, based on former financial policies, which included 75-25% split. We would need to amend our budget numbers to reflect the policy that was adopted today.
So we'll be having a public hearing on the budget.
I think,
At that time, we have to talk about the tipping rate.
is there a public hearing on the?
You don't need to have a public hearing on the budget.
Are we going to increase the tipping fee though?
I think we need to schedule a public hearing to adjust the tip fee, I think, to align with essentially a scenario 4.
Okay.
And we need to exit the budget with these changes. So practically, from a procedural standpoint, what's the path forward? Would it be that we set the public hearing on the rate for the next regularly scheduled meeting? We set our budget discussion for the next regularly scheduled meeting. And then we come back at our subsequent meeting and vote to approve the budget. Does that work? Does that give us enough time from a noticing standpoint?
We'll need to prepare a resolution for consideration by the board, and that resolution sets the tipping maximum, the tipping fee that you can consider, put that into the public notice. And so then we return to a subsequent meeting to consider that increase. So the next meeting, we could revise the budget in accordance with these actions, make sure we're clear on that. But Mr. Kramer discussed too that there was some details to iron out. So we'll have the finalized budget for your consideration, and then we can adopt a resolution, put the tipping fee into action, and then if that, and conduct a public hearing at the subsequent meeting. So as scheduled, those meetings are the 4th Wednesday of April and the 4th Wednesday of June. We can call a special meeting if you'd like, if those dates are insufficient.
I don't understand the schedule. Are we doing a public hearing in April to consider a rate increase?
It would have to be in June because we've got to adopt the resolution first.
Is it possible to adopt a resolution today?
Right.
I guess
We're not resolved to authorize that public hearing.
Well, you need to set the date of the public hearing and the resolution, and what the maximum amount will be. So I sort of agree with Alec that if you can adopt that resolution, which we can put in writing at the next meeting, then you can actually have the public hearing in June.
And I guess the updates to some of our financials, the financial assurances may have a small material impact on ultimately what the pro forma tipping fee would be. So maybe we would want that information at that next meeting as well.
Is that the normal timeframe we would receive that information?
Yes.
So then path forward is the next meeting in April. we will discuss updated budget numbers based on essentially what is scenario 4. We will adopt a resolution setting the maximum tip fee that we would consider, and we would set a date for that public hearing. And then we would come back, we would have the public hearing, and we would ultimately vote on the budget. What are the rules that govern the time between a public hearing and adoption of the budget?
There's no time. You can do it on the same day.
You do it on the same day?
Right, we're not gonna have a public hearing on the budget. It would just be the tip fees.
The tip fees,
Yeah.
okay.
I think that's.
Fair, I get it, okay. So then we would essentially set the public hearing date for the tip fee to be the June regularly scheduled meeting. And then if we saw fit, we could adopt the budget at that point.
That's what you've done in the past.
All right, our next meeting is April 23rd. At that meeting, we'll receive updated financials, an updated budget summary, and we will vote to set the tip fee public hearing. In June, we will adopt the budget.
Is there any consideration of doing it sooner than April 23rd, having a special meeting? It would be just, well, I don't know.
I mean, if there's a good reason to do so, I wouldn't see a problem with it.
All right, I mean, if the rest of the authority is comfortable with that time frame, I can.
I guess the question for Alec and Clark is how quickly could we have the new financial assurances, other financial information, the budget summary built, right?
Well, we are waiting for the study that we're doing for employee retention and the compensation study. So that's not complete. We hope to have that information by early or mid-April.
Okay. So then if we're considering the budget, I think probably that April date is a good one. That works for everyone.
Did we say the max number we wanted to put in there for the tipping rate? I think that's what Candy's asking to do her local budget, just so we can put a placeholder.
My guess would be, and when we advertise the rate, do we advertise 2 rates? I do. I would build in a small buffer between what's in the scenario 4 and what might come back with it. So if we're at what, 3104, something like that.
So 32.
$32.50, $33, something like that is maybe the max we would assume. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think the pro forma has proven to be pretty accurate over the years.
All right, with that,
Well, I'm sorry. What are we doing? Advertising a public hearing with a max rate of $32.50 or $33 or what?
I think that information was primarily for Candy's budget planning.
Right.
On April, we will come back, we'll get our updated budget projections. We'll see the impact that they had on the pro forma. At that point, we'll make the decision what the max number will be. We'll advertise that. Public hearing will be scheduled for our regular scheduled meeting in June. We'll have the public hearing and we'll vote on the budget at that date.
Thank you.
Did I say that right, everyone?
Lisa, and what was the buffer amount that we're contemplating?
I'd do 33 for budget planning. All right, that is the end of the agenda. Anyone want to make a motion to adjourn? Can I just do that?
I so move.
Okay.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
It's adjourned. Thank you.
Clark.